it's a journey. And a journey is not easy. It is a hard, spiritual, relational, existential journey of self-discovery. I'm a big proponent of psychedelic therapy. I think it's great. I think it can be helpful, but everybody's promising, that you take this drug once and then okay, that's it. Therapy's
Healed
over.
forever.
But at the core, we are social beings, and we heal and get hurt in relationships.
Welcome back to another episode of yisroelscorner. Today, I am hanging out with therapist Ben Matz. Ben, welcome to yisroelscorner.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Ben, tell me a little bit about your practice.
Well, yeah, thanks for asking. I work through a kind of eclectic approach where I bring in a few different types of therapies. I do, a little bit of a psychoanalytic, a little bit of like psychodynamic, which is a little bit more relational and interpersonal. I bring in a little bit of like existential therapy, and then I also do something called emotionally focused therapy. And I work, with different types of populations, but sometimes I'll do individual therapy, sometimes I'll do couples therapy, and then other times I'll do group therapy. So I do all three of these different forms of therapy. And, it's actually very interesting because, I think a lot of people know about, or I would say the most famous type of therapy is, maybe individual therapy. But I think a lot of people don't know of what like therapy can look like when there's multiple people in the room, not just, the therapist and the clients. So, this year I've started doing group therapy, and that's been a real trip of just kind of learning how to, work within a room, work with multiple people, facilitate that. So that's like a little bit of, how I do that.
Fascinating. Tell me more about group therapy, because I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, if I'm being honest, I'm I'm also learning my way through it. But group therapy is very interesting. The idea of group therapy is you have, between 5 and I believe, it could vary, maybe 8 or 10, participants in a room. And sessions can go from, hour 15 to hour and a half. Um, and there's a lot of different ways groups can look like. Some can be, what I do is more of like an interpersonal group. Sometimes groups can be a little bit more of like a supportive group. So maybe like a famous group that we all know is what you see on TV. Maybe like an AA group in Alcoholics Anonymous, where you go around, you say, "Hi, my name is Ben. I'm an alcoholic, an addict, etc." But the group that I do is something a little bit different. Um, you know, maybe at some point I'll explain more what I mean by like relational or interpersonal, but at least within, group, it's about really tracking interpersonal dynamics that can come up. So, we all have these relational patterns. I would say that's kind of like the foundation of, psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy, that there are these patterns that we compulsively repeat, for the therapists out there, right? Repetition compulsion. And I'm more in the relational category, so I always am tracking that within the relational sphere. And in individual therapy, individual relational therapy, I would be working with somebody, and between me and them, I would be tracking the relational dynamics that can come up between me and them, and our relationship, the therapeutic relationship, being the microcosm for things that can happen in a relationship outside of therapy, of course, right? In group, it's interesting because we're tracking the relational patterns that come up between group members. And as opposed to relational therapy, where maybe the goal is to have, as a famous psychoanalyst, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, would say, a corrective experience. The goal of, you would have a corrective experience between you and your therapist, and that would hopefully, help you see that, you can have positive relational experiences with people outside of therapy. In group therapy, it's more about the group giving you that corrective experience. So it's in some ways very similar, but in other ways it could be very different. And the beauty of group is group members in lifetime seeing what happens within, group dynamics. And then, if it's going well, and that's always a big if, but, if you're moving the ball forward in the right way in the group therapy, um, these corrective experiences would be happening, and group members would be supporting each other, and they would be pointing out different relational patterns that they see popping up between, group members, and they would say, oh, I see you always not taking up space in the group. Um, I wonder why that is. And the group member might say, oh, I just feel like I'm a burden or whatever. And then the group members would say, no, why do you feel that way? It's always such a pleasure when you share things. Very reductive. But this is a little bit of what group therapy kind of looks like. And, it's fascinating because in some ways it's very similar to individual, but other ways it's a whole different animal. So that's kind of like what group therapy looks like. And, I would say, there used to be a lot of stigma on individual therapy, and people were maybe in the 2000s we kind of shifted away from that, and now a lot of people go to therapy. And I think in like the 2010s there was like a big you know there was still the stigma when it came to couples therapy. And I think with the show Couples Therapy and whatever, I think the stigma is kind of going away, and a lot of people are now interested in couples therapy. But I would say one of the last things of therapy that I think a lot of people don't talk about is group therapy.
Fascinating.
And when I share with other people, what I do, and I tell them I'm a group therapist, and people ask me, "Oh, what's that like?" and I describe it, I still hear a lot of that old time stigma that we're used to of like, "Oh, that's so weird. Why would people want to do that?" And it's just interesting to see how group therapy can, one, just I guess doesn't get the recognition it deserves, and then two, to see that there's still a little bit of stigma there. I think it's I don't want to say it's the final frontier. I'm sure there's a lot we have to do with mental health, but it's definitely a place within, you know, the mental health world where we can do a lot more, education, and also I think getting rid a bit of that stigma.
I see. I see. Fascinating.
Mhm.
It almost sounds to me like a sort of like creating a therapeutic community, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, does that follow, the participants outside of the room as well?
yeah. That's a great question. So you know, what's interesting in group therapy is that we try to keep the relationship that occurs in the group. So, when we start the group, we give them, the participants, a little bit of a spiel about, trying not to hang out outside of therapy, trying not to contact each other, etc. We try to really keep it within the group. Um, the way that I can explain it is it's kind of similar to maybe your relationship with a therapist, right? A healthy relationship with a therapist is one that doesn't extend outside of therapy. In some ways, we try to really keep what comes up between you and your therapist or you and your group members contained in a very clinical environment. So that way it doesn't, add confounding variables. It doesn't make it a little messy. It doesn't, etc. Because when you're able to just keep within the group, it's much clearer, the dynamics that you see. If an hour and a half each week that you come in
Mm,
and, you're working with these group participants and there's nothing that's happening outside, what happens in that hour and a half really stays with you.
yeah.
And you're really locked into the nuances of other group members, of yourself. If you guys would go out for a drink afterwards or go to the movies, then things may get a little different. So in some ways, this is kind of like, I think, the scientific side of therapy that a lot of therapists don't talk about. But when you're able to keep things within the lab of therapy, so to speak, maybe that's making it a little more cold, because I do think the therapeutic environment's also warm and it's a holding space. But when you're able to keep it within this container, I think it's much easier to see and track patterns, and then also really better understand what's going on without maybe muddying, um, our minds or our thoughts or what our visions of what we're seeing. I hope that made sense, but that's kind of why we try to maybe keep it within the container of group.
I see. That does make sense.
Hmm.
Is a part of it also that when you show up for that hour,
Yeah,
um, you're kind of showing up. What's the word I'm looking for here? You're showing up kind of on, so to speak, right?
yeah,
Like you're gonna you're showing up your best, if you
yeah,
will, right? I'm
yeah,
I'm gonna give this hour the best of myself in this hour
yeah,
to the people here, right?
yeah.
Like I'm gonna show up as the best kind of parent, if you will.
You're saying the participants are
The
going to show up as
participants,
a
right?
parent? Oh,
Because
interesting.
I mean, the way I kind of view it is that
Mhm.
when a therapist shows up to therapy,
Yeah.
in some way they're showing up as like a good parent in some
Yeah.
sense. There's like a reparenting going on here, right? This is like part of the
Definitely.
relational thing, right?
Yeah.
So if we're showing up,
As a good object, if you
right,
want to be
exactly,
more object relational, but yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
everybody's kind of showing up as a good object for this hour.
Yeah.
Hanging out outside of that potentially opens
Mhm.
that up to, um, kind of like you're saying, maybe muddying that kind of perception that we're creating in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something, but I guess the way I approach, I feel like I have to say where I actually I struggle a bit with hearing that we want people to come in their best. Because I think a lot of people think that, therapy is about, showing up their best and doing the hard work. And, there is something to that. And I get why society is very into like this idea of working hard in therapy and et cetera. But, in recent years, I've kind of been shifting more towards this idea of I actually think therapy in some ways is more interesting when people don't show up their best.
Uh-huh.
Because I don't think the work of therapy is, a work that's about, I'm a good student and I'm showing up the best way possible. You know, therapy's so broad, so it's hard to, but if somebody has maybe people pleasing tendencies, then I think we're just reinforcing that. If somebody is, a hard worker and et cetera, right? Then or they're worried about being a burden, then I think we're just gonna be reinforcing that experience of them showing up their best. So I do like sometimes when people show up to therapy and they say, I have no idea what I want to say. I didn't even want to come here today. And then we say, okay, that's okay. Tell me more about that. What's coming up? Because I think when people aren't showing up at their best, aren't preparing, that's when you really start to see, with the psychoanalysts and what I like to call the unconscious content. And also maybe, what Carl Jung would call the shadow self, the part of ourselves that we don't always love, the part of ourselves that can maybe be darker. Um, you know, I guess as I'm talking, I'm also realizing, I once read this amazing line by a very famous relational therapist. I'm blanking on his name. It's either Edgar Sullivan or and I'm probably mixing it up. It's either Sullivan or Levinson, and I can't remember the first name, so I'm jumbling it up a bit here. But he has this great line in a analytic paper that he wrote where he says, "God save me from analysis that goes well,"
Okay.
and that really stuck with me.
Tell me more.
And his idea is that the
Yeah,
real work is, if it's okay for me to curse here,
go for
it's when
it.
shit hits the fan.
Understood. Understood.
Or,
Yeah.
or to not to lose my maybe the therapist watching here.
Yeah.
It's when a rupture occurs, um, because I think that's when the real work can occur, when things are messy, when people are showing up, maybe not always the best ways. Um, I'm rambling a bit here, but I think people complain often if my Instagram algorithm is anything reflective of reality, and that's a big question.
That's a big question right there.
Probably not, but because it's alive in
Yeah.
my head, I think I see a lot of people complaining about how their therapists are just validating them and just telling them they're doing a good job, and they're with ChatGPT therapy, you could just go online and you could just have you tell you that this terrible business that's going to make you go bankrupt is amazing, and it could just validate you, and it could tell you that that you're cheated on your spouse, that that's actually okay, and all these things. And I think sometimes therapists would fall into that, but I think to me at the core of what therapy is about, it's a real relationship. Yes, it's a therapeutic relationship, and there are certain boundaries to it. There are ways that it is different, but to me, it's a real relationship. And a real relationship involves not the great stuff, right? There's going to be some friction. There's going to be some anger. There's going to be some jealousy. There's going to be, you know, some unfortunately letting down, all these things. Um, but I think that's the beauty of therapy is that you can have all these things that, we deem as problematic and messy. But the beauty of therapy is we really learn how to work through it. We really learn how to get to this place where if your therapist let you down, the goal isn't that, to just hold that in and move on, but to really work on it, to maybe know how to talk about it. And that could be, if it's the beginning of therapy, the therapist trying to push you to bring it in, or if you're, maybe towards the middle or, end parts of therapy, maybe you've worked on this, for so long that you feel comfortable to let your therapist know that they let you down. And then the therapist to really hear you, not get defensive, take it in, talk about it. I think that's a corrective experience. I think that's something different than what we're used to. And I think that models, if you're in a relationship, like a romantic one, or with your friends, or maybe at a job, right? Instead of getting defensive with your work, instead of holding in your frustration, you then learn how to communicate and how to handle that discomfort. So to me, therapy is about learning these things. So I guess is a very long-winded way of pushing back on,
It's a very long-winded way of saying you're absolutely wrong, Israel. So,
exactly.
understood.
And this is a corrective experience now.
I like that. Yeah, very good.
The relationship is getting messy.
Wow. Yeah. Let's see if I can make it through this and actually, what's the opposite of rupture?
We have repair.
Repair. Okay. Let's see if we can repair this now.
All right.
I guess where my mind went with that
Sure.
is just considering how I'm imagining in this group therapy setting, you're essentially there on one level as patient,
Yeah.
but also on some level as therapist. Like everybody's acting as therapist to each other.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious how that dynamic works.
Yeah. I mean that's an amazing question. Yeah. It's. I don't know if I would go as far as saying that it's fully, being patient and therapist, because I do think, that's why there's then a therapist there who
Fair, yeah.
facilitates. But, within certain types of doing this group therapy, sometimes the therapist there also becomes the patient, which can be interesting. Sometimes they too. That's not always how I work, but in certain modalities. Well, actually, I know we're both fans of Irvin Yalom, right? So he's a big group therapist, and he, sometimes in his writings will talk about, the therapist sometimes being a little bit more involved, and maybe, obviously to some extent, you have to be careful and not bring too much of yourself in and make things, too messy. But sometimes the therapist can be very real there. Um, without getting too into specifics, I remember there was a group therapy session where I dropped the ball, and then I made space, and the group participants would then talk about how I maybe didn't do the best job to make such a safe environment. I didn't do such a great job to make sure that you know explain what was going on, maybe clue them in, and I don't want to get too much into the specifics here, but I think that was actually a very interesting session to have, where here I am, and I did a rupture, and I had to try my best to repair, and my repair was just hearing and taking it in. And as tough as it was to hear that I didn't do the best job, but you have to take it in sometimes. But to come to your original question, um, you know, to me, it's kind of like couples therapy. And maybe I'm just going to go through all the different types of therapies that I
Cool.
do.
Yeah.
Um, within couples therapy, you have 3 people in the room, and your goal as the couple therapist is to be the therapist of the relationship and not the therapist of the 2 participants. At least if you're coming through an emotionally focused therapy perspective, which I am, EFT. Um, and the goal is, yeah, you try to validate, you try to, be there for the 2 clients, but also you're trying to push them to be there for each other. A big thing of emotionally focused therapy is, we want to move from self-regulation, meaning, if you yourself are feeling, frustrated, you try to deal with it, maybe you breathe, maybe you talk to yourself in a kinder way, whatever, to co-regulation. And co-regulation is the 2 participants, the 2 people in the couple trying to be there for each other. Now, there's some crazy studies, absolute crazy studies, where they wanted to see, how long does it take to self-regulate versus how long does it take to co-regulate. So I don't remember exactly the study, but they taught us in the EFT externship, in the trainings, that the researchers found that to self-regulate, it took 20 minutes. Now to co-regulate, and they had basically like a a husband or wife or people in like a romantic relationship kind of near each other, and they said, they did the experiment, and then they want to see what the co-regulation was like. They found it took 20 seconds.
Wild.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And then they wanted to see. I don't remember exactly the study. Maybe the first time they did talking, on the second time they want to see what would it be like if just one partner put their hands on the other person's like shoulder or knee, and I found that was just as effective. So I guess this kind of goes to my, if I had a soapbox here and I had my belief and my gospel that I wanted to tell the world was just how relational we are as human beings. At the core, we are social beings, and we heal and get hurt in relationships. And that's kind of what pulled me towards this relational path of therapy, because I really believe that at the core, obviously there's cognitive distortions, there's maybe parts of ourselves that we need to heal. I mean, there's all these things that I think are important. But from that study, what it made me realize was just how important relationships are to the mental health. And then, if I can continue on my soapbox, if that's okay, um, there've been all these, there've been tons of studies trying to understand like what really works in therapy. Is it like your therapist training? Is it like, the years of experience that your therapist has? Is it your ability? Is it the patient's ability to come in and be interested in, their buy-in to therapy? All these different things they want to see. Is it your modality? Is it CBT? Is it IFS? Is it, psychoanalysis? All these things they wanted to see, like what exactly makes somebody, makes a therapy successful. And after many studies, many meta-analyses of the studies, what they come down to is the number one predictor of what's going to ensure that a therapy is successful is the relationship between the patient and the therapist. The relationship. And I think what people often miss is that therapy is about the relationship. That's actually what ensures that people are able to heal. And then, from what I was talking about, the co-regulation, whether that happens in individual therapy between you and your therapist and you co-regulate, whether, you come to couples therapy and it's, you know, you and your partner or spouse regulate, right? Or whether it's in group therapy where, you and the group members co-regulate each other. That to me is really what therapy is about. So that's kind of like the modality that I'm interested in. That's just kind of what I try to do in therapy is I really center the therapeutic relationship, and I really try to make this an environment where you can show up however you need to show up, whether that's perfect or not, your best or you're not, preferably not your best. And you really, you really learn to be accepted in that environment. And, through maybe the therapist accepting you, you can internalize that object and then maybe get to this place where you yourself are able to internalize that you should be accepted. So, this is kind of, I'm sure there's a lot that I'm leaving out and all that, but this is kind of like on one foot, so to speak, what to me relational therapy is about and what to me, couples therapy is about. So, you asked like how are group members able to be, patients and therapists. I would say I think a lot of life is shifting between, you know, taking up space and giving up space. A lot of it's about, trying to be in this place where you're able to be there for another human being and then also receive. So, I think what group members struggle with and what a lot of the group is can they take in when other people are trying to be there for them? And can they also be there for other people? So I would want to maybe shift away from like patient therapy because I think that um, maybe isn't the best way to describe what goes on in group, but I think better it's being there for others and receiving from others. And you'd be surprised how hard it is to receive from others. I think a lot of us can really, really struggle
Mm.
taking in, positive
Mm.
feedback. It could be really tough.
What do you think it is about that we're so resistant?
Man, that is such a $1 million question. Honestly, I don't know. And I try to shift away from simple answers. Um, to criticize. I now spoke so highly about psychoanalysis and psychodynamic, and I use it interchangeably, though. I'm sure if we were in the in the institutions, people would would have harsh words to say about
Yeah, get in
that. But
trouble, huh?
yeah, get me in trouble. But I think I talked about being an I talked about my eclectic approach. Maybe to give a little bit more insight into why I gravitate towards that. Um, I think a lot of the history of therapy is somebody coming along and somebody saying, "Oh, I finally figured out the answer. All the issues that a human being has is X." And then 15 to 20 years later, another person comes in and says, that person was half right or half wrong or completely wrong. And then, this is the answer. Really, the genesis of the, root causes of our issues can be boiled down to one thing.
Yeah. And then every one of your friends that's reading a new book that claims that will come to you and tell you, I finally found the answer.
Exactly. And when I
Yeah.
when I hang out with therapists, we all have different modalities and we all like to say, oh, what about this? What about that? And I come down to this place where I believe that the mind is too complicated to have a simple answer. You know, the mind, consciousness, whatever we want to call it, it very well might be one of the most complicated structures in the known universe. The neurons that are in there are an insane amount, maybe as much as stars. Who knows? I'm sure scientists would correct me on that. But I mean, there really are a lot of neurons there. Um, I don't think we can just simplify, a mental health disorder, certain incorrect thought patterns, whatever, to just a simple thing and saying it's just this one thing. Um, so I really like working through a broad approach where you see the human as a whole, and you could see that many things can go wrong. My shift, from not being so interested into psychoanalysis and being more interested in psychodynamic, very reductive, but psychodynamic tries to blend in a lot of different, ideas and theories and schools of thought within psychoanalysis. Tries to blend it into not the best blend, but it tries to say, there's a lot of different things that can be going on. It could be relational patterns. It could be, what comes up, between you and your parents in your childhood, right? It could be certain traumas. It could be the unconscious and the fantasy world within us, and there are incorrect thought patterns that don't match up to reality. It believes that it could be a lot of things. Um, so I guess again, the long-winded thing that I'm trying to say here is I don't think we are ever able to say that people struggle with feedback because of one simple thing that has in this modality. I think it's a lot of things, and you know, if I can get on another soapbox, I think a lot of therapy these days, it's very poor because people have gone into what I like to call therapy wars, where we think that everything could be reduced to one simple modality, one simple technique, school of thought. And a lot of people, I think, leave it saying, okay, maybe therapy helped me a little bit with one thing, but doesn't really heal them in a total way. What I like to do is I like to try to heal somebody in many different realms. And you're working on multiple things at the same time, but I think you leave therapy not just getting rid of one issue, but living it with a richer life, which I think also is missing in a lot of therapy, of not just getting rid of symptoms, but also enriching your life. Because, you know, how great is it if I leave therapy and I'm not depressed anymore, but then I feel directionless and, maybe I'm not depressed, but I'm not happy, right? So I think the goal of therapy is a lot of different things.
Hmm. Wow. So much to think about.
Mm. I know I've been
Really.
rambling a lot.
No, yeah. I really like the way you're framing therapy. This idea that, um, I guess it's essentially not to be too closed off or dogmatic,
No, go for it.
um, really resonates with me.
Mm.
Um, in some way, I almost feel like good good therapy can only lead to that conclusion because part of what we're doing with therapy is, um, stopping to think in extremes or,
Mhm.
being able to see some gray area in life. Not everything is one way or another. So
Yeah.
to hold on tightly to one approach is to almost, you're negating some
Yeah.
some fundamental aspect of what you're trying to do, you know?
Yeah. No, no,
um,
exactly. I mean, human life is so complex, and there's so many things that go on. And I think we often look for what I like to call cheap solutions. And there's just too much existentially and relationally and in the unconscious and in behaviors and thoughts and, in our past, just to say, okay, just do this one technique, this one skill in a skill book, and then like, challenge these one thoughts, and then everything's gonna be great. Um, you know, I guess I almost think that we make it too simple about how hard it is to really heal. I think healing is actually very hard work.
Mm.
I don't think the task of being a therapist is easy. I don't think the task of being a patient is easy. I think these are all really tough things that we're doing. The other day I opened up this book and I was just flipping through the pages and I saw this beautiful line where Sigmund Freud was describing therapy as like a chess game, an intense chess game where you're not quite sure where the moves are going to lead to, but only at the end of the game can you then retrace the steps and say, "Oh, okay, I see how this actually helped this, and I see
Fascinating.
how this can help this."
Mm.
And this is not the sexiest what I'm about to say, but also there are passages where Freud describes also the therapeutic process as a literal war, a battle, where the therapist and the patient are allies and trying to work on. I mean, he has this kind of archaic language. I believe he's talking about like the id, but to put it more into modern language, where he says the therapist and the patient are working together, in the self-sabotaging part of the patients, and it's a real battle, and it's not a given. It's not a given who's going to win. It's not a given what's going to happen. Um, I actually pull a lot more from these older approaches. Um, you know, I take a lot from Freud, though I also disagree from him in a lot of different ways. I take a lot from, these psychodynamic schools of thought. I really pull from, these schools of thought that have been debated and challenged, since the late 1800s to, I mean, till today, but I would say, more the 90s was when psychodynamic therapy, from my understanding, was a little bit more formulated. Though, it's still going through changes and all that. That's over 100 years of thought that's been going back and forth on, and in some ways they've gotten really wrong. I mean, there's certain ideas that have gone, you know, that I think have done more harm than good, but in other ways there's these ideas that have really come up through it that are also, really powerful ideas that I think are very helpful. Um, I think sometimes the more modern approaches to therapy, while also adding a lot that I think these older approaches can learn from, I think they sometimes fall into this more like pop therapy idea where I think they take away the journey, the messiness. They promise instant gratifications. They say, "Oh, you do 12 to 24 sessions, and that's it. We're gonna get rid of all your issues, or all your issues can be reduced to this thing." But I guess to the crux of it, to me, what therapy is, it's a journey, and a journey is not easy. It is a hard, spiritual, relational, existential journey of self-discovery of knowing thyself. And that is not an easy journey. That's not one that one always wants to buy into. It's one that's not always easy week after week. Um, I think therapy sometimes can be seen as like, oh, you just go to your therapist and, that's it. But I think that's not it. I think it's really a tough journey that can really have hard moments where, like I said, can be messy. You can be butting heads with the therapist. There could be real ruptures. There could also be real repairs. There could be real moments of real intimacy. There could be real moments of, self-love and love between you and the therapist. So therapy is a very complicated thing. And even as I'm talking, from my understanding, I can even be saying, "Oh, I'm being too reductive here. I'm overlooking this one aspect." So, it's very hard to say what exactly therapy is, and it's very hard exactly to say, what is, you know, behind all these things. But I think natural curiosity and knowing a lot of techniques, I think is what gets you somewhere.
Um, I'm curious to explore more with you. So, we've talked about um, how the relationship is so important in the
Yeah.
therapeutic relationship. Um, Acceptance, right?
Yeah.
And then, if the therapist is able to be accepting of you, you're able to be more accepting of yourself. What
Yeah.
what else goes into good therapy in your view?
Wow, that's a great question. As I'm talking, I'm reminding of one of my favorite lines I've ever read by Carl Jung, and I'm gonna butcher it a bit, so apologies. But it goes something along the lines. This is like his advice to therapists. He says, "Know all the theories, know all the techniques, but when you're in the room, sitting in front of a human being, just try to be another human being,
Mm.
another human soul, touching and engaging with another human soul." Now, I think that could be taken to the extreme of just, oh, therapy is just vibes and just be whatever. So, I do feel like I have to come in and I have to say, you do need to know the therapy and the techniques. But what I love about that is I think what being a good therapist is about is being present and naturally curious in the room. I don't think it's coming in with quick answers, though, all of us therapists, we have our days when maybe we do that. There's actually a great line by Winnicott, another famous analyst who um, he was very involved with object relations and also Freudian thought, British psychoanalyst. He said that on days when he's a little tired and not as engaged, he finds himself talking more, and on days when he's you know being a good therapist, he's listening more. Um, so I guess to answer your question of like what makes a good therapist. I think there's a lot of things, but in this moment, what comes to me is really trying to just be present with the person in front of you, trying to be curious, trying to really hear, actively listen, actively engage, really sit with what they're talking about, and then try to reflect it back, try to maybe challenge them, throw some interpretations, track certain relational patterns that maybe you're noticing. If they're talking about um, how their friends often report that I don't know, maybe they don't always find that they're able to be so emotional when their friends share tough things. I could say, oh, maybe I'm feeling that in this room or whatever. Um, but I think therapy is a lot of things, and I would say just coming back to that Carl Jung thing of just trying to be a human in that room to the best of your ability. And contrary to popular belief, I think it's very hard to be a human.
Mhm.
I think I think we all have days when maybe we're not feeling like we can really just be there for another human being. And, you know, that's also the struggle at times, right? We're not always able to be perfect. As human beings, we're imperfect, and that's okay. And I think we need to learn to try our best to be who we can be, given our capacity.
I see. This relates, I guess, to the rupture
Mhm.
repair issue, right? Because
Yeah,
sometimes you're going to show up to therapy, I guess, without, you know, you don't fully got it.
of
And
course.
then what do
Yeah,
you do?
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Very common to show up and not know what to
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But you know what I find? Those are the best sessions. When somebody comes in and they say, I don't know, things seem fine. I don't know what to talk about. I say, great. Sounds like we're not putting out any fire this week. And maybe we can go deep. We can go into like what is really going on in that world. Maybe we can
Mm.
actually go into your childhood. Maybe we can actually see, you know, things that have been really hard to tap into. Um, so to me, those are sometimes the exciting sessions.
Fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's that catching me off guard, I guess, a little bit with that
Oh
one.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Why
like
why
that.
is that catching you off guard?
I just feel like in my own therapy,
Yeah.
like the days that I don't have much to talk about, it almost feels like a waste of time.
Mm.
But I like what you're saying. It's like, well, no, maybe it's an opportunity to address things that, typically we don't have time to address,
Exactly.
that are actually maybe even more fundamental or more important.
Yeah, because I think one of my beliefs is that sometimes like the presenting problem, right? Like the symptoms that are very manifest. Sometimes those are distractions from what's really going on that's deeper. Or sometimes those are just, the flag that's like saying, hey, you have to dig. This is the X that marks the spot. You have to dig deeper here
Mhm.
because there's something deeper behind this. I don't think people's issues are ever as easy as, oh, it's just anxiety, it's just depression. Usually there's so much deeper behind that. Um, so I don't know. I mean, that to me is what's interesting. And then also, because I'm so relational, I believe in therapeutic relationships. Sometimes when somebody comes in and they say, "Oh, I have nothing to talk about," I say, "Maybe we can get to know each other more." Maybe we
Hmm.
can deepen the relationship. We could talk
Oh,
about things
wow.
that, usually when there's a fire going on in your life, we can't get into. Maybe now you could tell me about who you really are, and I could get like a real 3D, multifaceted perspective of who you are as a human being and not just your issues. Because nobody's ever just their issues and nobody's ever just their trauma or their, symptoms. People are so multifaceted. And that's my eclectic approach of there's so much to a human being. Let's really try to just look at them as their totality, and not just reduce it to something simple.
Hmm.
I feel like I really stumped you with this.
They gave me a lot to think about. Um, I'm curious to hear more. You brought up earlier, um, how therapists can sometimes be a little bit too passive,
Mm.
and that's something that I've actually brought up. I think I brought it up in both of my previous
Oh,
podcasts,
really?
um,
Huh.
because I find that that's a frustration of mine. Talk to me about confrontation and you know not just being a yes man therapist.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, let me also say I do have days when maybe I'm not the best therapist and I can be the yes man. So I don't want to, God forbid, front and
I
pretend,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
I can be
I,
fairly agreeable myself sometimes, so I
yeah,
I, I can understand that.
yeah. But yeah, I think as human beings, we all have shifts. So I think we're noticing both of us could sometimes be maybe too agreeable. Um, I think there's also days where maybe I could be too confrontational.
Uh, yeah,
So
yeah.
try to
I can
find
relate to
that.
that too. I can
Yeah.
relate to that too. Fair enough.
I had a feeling
Yeah.
you'd be
Bring
able
up
to
religious
relate.
issues and suddenly, what happened? The hell.
Exactly. Listen, we all have
Yeah.
our triggers,
Yeah.
I know that word has lost so much its meaning these days and has been used too much, but we all have our things that can really get to us.
The inner buffer, the inner yeshiva buffer comes out, and suddenly I'm like studying Gemara with you, and you're like, wasn't looking for a fucking debate here.
I joke with my clients whenever they start asking me questions about like the therapy world or a therapy TikTok they saw. I said, "Listen, I'm happy to answer, but no, you're hitting my trigger. I'm
Yes.
gonna be getting on my soapbox, and you may have to stop me because I could spend hours just ranting about my issues and all these things. So listen, we're all human in the end of the day. Um, and as I'm talking, I realize I completely forgot the question. Could you repeat
We're
it,
talking
please?
about. I'm interested in hearing
Oh,
more about confrontation in the room
gotcha.
and not being agreeable.
Mm. Sounds like maybe my defenses came up and I suppressed that that question. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a great question. It's hard to speak in such broad terms, but I think my goal as a therapist is to say the things that people don't always want to hear. Now, I'm not going to say it, in a way that's, going to re-traumatize them or whatever. Obviously the goal is to try to be a safe and holding environment. And, there's ways to, prepare somebody when I'm about to say something heavy. Sometimes I'll say, you may not like what I'm about to hear. Get ready. But I wonder if what you're talking about, comes towards your traumatic childhood and something that happened between you and one of your parents or whatever. Um, but, I think when therapy is done well, all the feelings are coming up. Maybe not every session. And maybe, you shouldn't feel angry with your therapist 50% of the time. That to me is not great therapy. But for it to be good, there should be a good amount of anger and frustration coming up between you and your therapist. And the healing would be, the therapist being able to deal with it and try to walk you through it. Um, so I guess to be to come back to your question, it's not always easy because, sometimes you have to push your patients in ways that maybe they don't want to be pushed. And obviously, you have to know their capacity. You have to know the day. If they're coming in tired and cranky, yeah, that's real. That's probably not the day to, you know, talk about their trauma or whatever. So you always have to be gauging, what is good for somebody. Um, but I think it can be tough at times to be a therapist who isn't just going to yes man. But I think I have a deep fear of being a therapist who just tells their clients that everything they're doing is okay and that they have nothing to fix and that they just have to love themselves more. I fear one, maybe, them talking about, to their friends, their therapist, and older friends looking at them being like, "That's your therapist." So I never want to be that therapist.
Mm.
But also too, I think I really believe in the work, and I think I really have faith in the therapeutic process and these ideas and all the things. And I never want to cheapen somebody out in the experience of therapy because I think, these days we have a lot of, you know, quantity. We don't have a lot of quality. And I think we really need quality therapy. And quality therapy is at times really challenging somebody and really telling them the stuff that they don't want to hear. And if you're a good therapist and if you know what you're doing, not always, but sometimes you're able to really land the ship. You're able to really take things where it needs to be going. Um, so I don't know if that answered exactly your question. Feel free to maybe prompt me more, but I guess that's a little bit of the challenge of being a confrontational. I don't know. I want to say confrontational therapy, but a therapist who's able to push somebody and not just being a yes man. I think there's a real challenge where you care about the person you've been working with them. You've learned to, form a connection with them. So you don't want to, harm them or be too tough, but also, you care about them. I guess as I'm talking, I know I said as giving more questions, but as I'm talking and the hamster wheel in my brain is going, I wonder if it's a little bit of like being a parent where there are times when you have to say, no to your child because it's good for them. And there's times when you know that if you're just going to be a yes man, you're going to create a monster. You're going to create, somebody who can't handle no. You're somebody who can't be able to, handle these things. So, I think I think a lot of the ideas within therapy don't just, the things that we can see outside of life. And I think a lot of the ideas were, like the object relations, so that's like Winnicott and Melanie Klein. A lot of their theories came from, you know, taking care of children, observing children, being a mother or a father, etc. So, these things are things that we can see outside in the world and we can bring into the therapeutic process and see what's healing. But again, I'm, going on a little tangent here. Um, but, to me, I think, sometimes medicine is bitter. It can help you, but it's bitter. Exercising, it could hurt. It's exhausting. I don't always want to do it, but some days you got to do it. Um, so I think that's a little bit of what it's like, real medicine. And I do think therapy is real medicine. It needs to not just always be comfortable. But I feel like I gave you a prompt for a question and I went on another tangent. So let me.
No, that was very good.
Okay.
You and I have
Mhm.
discussed a Canadian psychoanalyst, Donald Carveth.
Yeah.
Both fans, right?
Big fans.
Hope to have him on. I wonder,
Oh,
that would be cool. If I do,
I would, in a heartbeat, I would be here.
yeah, that'd be very
I
cool.
would cancel anything on my calendar.
Cool. We
Uh,
both fangirl over him.
yeah. I think
Uh,
there may only be 200 people in this world who are fans of him, but
but those 200 people are hard fans. I'm a
and
hard
two of them
fan,
are
dude.
in this room.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
If you're watching Donald Carveth, um, in his work, he talks about, you know, and I guess I learned these terms from him. He talks about the insight schools and the relational schools.
Mm.
And to me, what we're talking about here kind of touches on both of them, right? So you have the relational schools, like we're talking about, and being the way I'm framing it is kind of like being the good parent or the good object, and
Yeah.
helping, being accepting and helping the patient accept themselves. Um, and then, confrontation, I feel like comes in on the insight side of psychology, where
Mm.
we're looking to dig a little bit deeper, and the patient is not seeing something, and you're like, you need a little more insight in your life. Here's the would you agree with my characterization here?
Oh, you're
Like,
saying like a separation between inside and relational
correct.
therapy?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I would agree that there's a separation. I would just say, and again, yeah, who am I to ever disagree with Don Carreth? I mean, he's a genius. But from my limited understanding, psychodynamic tries to incorporate insight too. Um, relational schools of thought really also bring in the more, psychodynamic tries to bring relational and then also really tries to bring in the insight oriented stuff, like exploring maybe the unconscious, the subconscious, understanding the fantasy realm that we can be in, understanding how that matches up to reality. Um, so at least the approach that I work in, it really tries to marry. It doesn't always, like any good marriage, right? Not everything overlaps perfectly, but that's okay. But it does try to make space for all these things. I think it would just be very poor therapy if it only focused just on the relational aspects, because there's a lot more also going on in the mind. Also, obviously the relationship between one and themselves, that's also very real. But what were you getting? What were we trying to get to about Darren Koba?
I guess I'm just curious, um, if you see that I guess I was curious to see if you see that confrontational aspect as other than the relational
Mm.
approach to therapy. Um,
Well, to me, I work for such an eclectic approach that I really am happy to bring it all and interweave it, even if it doesn't always connect. Sometimes I'll bring in modalities that fundamentally disagree with each other, but I believe they're both pointing towards a truth. Um, you were talking about like how, things may be nuanced and gray. Maybe if we can get to like my philosophical, uh, approach of therapy is that, truth is very multifaceted and it can be contradictory at times. Um, I believe in trying to embrace the contradictions of life. You know, um, Hopefully this won't be too triggering, but you're bringing up, religion,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's hard not to think of this Hasidic master, a Hasidic rabbi by the name of Simcha Bunim, and the lore goes that he would carry within himself, two pieces of paper and two different pockets of his. One that would say that for me the world was created, and in the other pocket, for me I'm dust and ashes. Now these are two very contradictory statements. How can you say I'm so amazing? How can you say I don't matter? But I think truth really, truth resides in that very thin line between two contradictory statements. And within the psychoanalytic world, Melanie Klein, who came up with the School of Object Relations, um, again, that might be a little reductive, but forgive me. She came up with this idea. She said that we have this idea called splitting. Now, she talked to more about, maybe people with certain personality disorders like borderline or etc. And the idea of splitting, but I think we all do splitting, and maybe I misunderstood her. Maybe she was saying that everybody has it. But she believes that splitting is this idea that we split. I don't want to get too technical, so I may make it a little reductive and oversimplify it. But her idea is that when we look at a human being, we may see their good parts and we may see their bad parts, and instead of embracing both, we may split
Yeah,
and we only
yeah,
see good
yeah, yeah, yeah.
parts, and we may only see bad parts. But the work of therapy is to learn how to hold the contradictory truths of you're Yisrael. I like talking to you. I enjoy with you, and there's parts of you that I like, and I'm sure there's also parts of you that I don't like, but I can embrace you as a whole, and I'm sure you can do the same
Which
for
parts
me.
of me don't you like?
Oh, well, let's go
Yeah.
through the laundry list.
God,
Actually, let me pull out my phone. No, I'm
fuck.
joking. I'm
Rupture
joking.
repair, baby. Yeah,
Well, you asked, what is it
yeah,
like to
yeah.
be a therapist? You could say,
Yeah, yeah. Do you love me though?
I do. I do.
Repair.
I do.
Yeah.
Well, people may not know this, but
Yeah.
me and you bump into each other every now and then in the place that you used to work at. And I would go to the store to buy something, but in reality, I would actually come just to hang out with you. And we'd spend about a good half hour just talking about our love for Darren Carveth, our thoughts on therapy, psychoanalysis, existential philosophy, and etc. And I always enjoy talking with you, and I always feel like we have great conversations. And maybe call back to early in the session. I hope you could accept the feedback.
I was just about to say that's very flattering. I don't know. Yeah, I'm trying to take that in right now and be okay with that. God,
How does it feel?
I feel like I'm being held up on a pedestal now that I'll never be able to, I'll never be able to live up to that.
I
God.
don't know about that. I think you're selling yourself a bit short.
Okay.
Mm.
I'll do my best here. I appreciate that very much. I really appreciate talking to you as well.
Yeah.
Um, if we can, I'd
Mm.
like to move into maybe some practical advice that you might
Mm.
have for anybody listening. I guess it could be related
Yeah.
to any issue that they might be going through, but something that they can take home with themselves. Whether it be how to find a good therapist, an exercise they can do, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I'm very not such a practical therapist, so I need to take a moment to think about something smart to
Yeah,
say.
yeah.
Well, let me start with defining the therapist part. Because I get that question a lot, and I mean, I think it's a real. Well, let me first validate. Say, I think it's very hard to find a good therapist. I don't think that means that there's bad therapists out there, but to come full circle to what we were talking about, I think therapy is about the relationship, and it's okay not to be able to form or have a good relationship with every human being that's off the street, right? You know, not every therapist is going to be able to form a good relationship with you, and that's not because they're a bad therapist, and not because you're a bad person. It really just could be you're not two people who mesh. So I guess my advice about how to find a good therapist is to realize that one, it's a journey. Two, this is a cliche, but it is kind of like dating. You have to find somebody
Mm.
that you really, want to come in week after week and spend, roughly 45 minutes to an hour in that room. Um, Now it'd be too tall of an order to say you want every day, every week to come in and be super excited about therapy. I mean, that's unrealistic. I don't care what there is in this world. In the end, it is medicine, it is health. It's not always easy to show up. Um, but I do think realizing that it's the relationship and trying to see first, instead of their credentials or their wisdom or whatever, first see how you feel in the room. Are you able to connect with them? Does it feel, somewhat nice to be there? Are they engaging, etc. So I like that. And then two, after maybe, 4 or 5 sessions, I get a lot of friends come to me and they say, Ben, here are my mixed feelings about my therapist. And they say, like, what do you think? Do you think I should leave? And my response usually is, I think the sign of a good therapist is you take your frustrations or you take what you're unsure about and you share with the therapist. And if they're good, they will engage with it, they will talk about it, they will find everything they got to do. And if at the end of talking about it in a few weeks you say, oh wow, they've turned the corner or turned a new leaf, and hey, wow, we're heading a different direction, you feel like that's good, then to me that's a sign that you have a good therapist.
Mm.
um Again, I think the work of therapy is to talk about it, and sometimes it could be tough. I mean, you're talking about every little thing that comes up, certain feelings, etc. But if your therapist is good, they would really be able to hear your concerns or frustrations and work with it. So to me, that's a bit of my advice. Look for the relationship, and then two, look for somebody who's really able to hear you and really able to work through it with you. If there's a rupture, even though maybe rupture is too strong a word, really repair it. Because I think that's the healing of therapy,
Hmm.
really being able to repair certain things.
Fascinating. Um, was there anything else you wanted to share, Ben Matz?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess you asked for more advice, and feeling maybe I should add another thing. I guess my other piece of advice is learning that therapy is a journey, and it's a messy one. And if you're looking to get started, looking to try to embrace the journey. Easier said than done, but I'm very skeptical of the quick fixes that the current mental health system is trying to, throw to us. And I can't tell you how many have come up. And
You're not talking about CBT, are you?
I am talking about CBT. Well, listen,
Yeah.
CBT when it came onto the field, they promised we could heal things in 12 to 24 sessions.
Was that the promise?
That was one of the promises,
Wild.
and insurance companies loved it. Wow, you're
Yeah,
telling me
yeah,
that you don't
yeah,
have to
yeah.
just go to your psychoanalyst for 3 to 5 years and whatever. But every CBT therapist I've ever talked to says, "Yeah, I do CBT for the first 20 sessions, and then after that, we then shift towards a more psychodynamic approach,
Very
where we then
interesting.
explore because, great, we got rid of your anxious thoughts, but your life is still not enriched, so let's try to enrich it."
Hmm.
Um, so I think there's that, and then now with the rise of psychedelic therapy, maybe at some point we could talk more about that. I'm a big proponent of psychedelic therapy. I think it's great. I think it could be helpful, but everybody's promising that you take this drug once and then okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
it,
yeah.
therapy's
Healed
over. But
forever.
but the human life isn't like that. It's a messy journey, and in the end of the day, mental health is health. Now that means it's a long journey to heal. It means that even if you're not in therapy, you have to make sure you're taking care of yourself, whatever way that means for you, whether that's not working too hard, trying to make time for friends and family, trying to take time for, slowing down in life, whatever it is. But I think what the health system is very unhealthy. And to me, the beauty of the world that I come from, which is the psychodynamic world, is that we believe that life is inherently messy and we have to really slow down with the work and just give into the journey. And before you know it, you'll get what you're looking out of it. But I think when you try to rush things, um, I'm not a believer in it. I'll say this. The mind is such a hard thing to heal. It's very elastic. We have neuroplasticity, but the mind isn't something that you're just able to, take a drug or, do a few skills and that's it, right? End of day. Um, it really takes a while to heal. I remember when I tore my ACL, happened a few, maybe 3 years ago. Um, this is a ligament that I had surgery on, but honestly, if I wouldn't have had surgery on, I could have functioned somewhat normally. I wouldn't have been able to do sports. I wouldn't have been able to, do too much, but I would have been able to function somewhat normally without an ACL. So now it's an important ligament for twisting, turning, sports, a lot, doing that kind of activity, but it is something that, God forbid if you lose it, you can't function as someone without it. It took a year to heal. And I like to share this with the people I work with. So a ligament that it's not superfluous, but it is something that I could have lived my life without it, took a year to heal. How long do you think your mind is going to take to heal?
God,
Now, it
might
doesn't
as
mean you
well
have to be
give up now.
well, yeah. No, it doesn't mean you have to be in therapy for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean any of that stuff. But I think, if I give advice would be we need to slow down with our mental health journeys. I think we're all trying to do too
Mm.
much and try to be our best and try to, hack it or whatever. But it's the mind. You need to allow it to heal the way it needs to heal. I remember to come back to my ACL, after a few months, I did very intensive physical therapy. Thankfully, my knee was getting stronger, and I went into the doctor's office for my, follow up after surgery. And I remember my surgeon said, "Okay, Ben, so here's the good news and here's the bad news." Okay. So the good news is your knee is so strong. You're way ahead of where you need to be. You're taking it seriously. We love that. I'm like, okay, great. He's like, here's the bad news. I'm like, oh no. The bad news is that you can't rush the process of the ligament. And the more stronger your knee is gonna get, because I was on crutches and then I, was doing these exercises. He said, the more you may forget that you need to meet your ligament where it's at. So you need to actually slow down. You need to keep doing what you're doing, but you need to be more mindful because, the muscles around your knee are very different than where your ligament is. And I think that's something that I see sometimes in therapy where people think that, you know, they'll see them start to get a little bit better and then say, okay, great, let's slow it down. Let's not meet as often. Let's do these things. And I do think it's important to slow down, but I do think we try to rush the process. We don't understand that even when we go to therapy and we don't see any changes within us, things are slowly changing within. There are shifts internally within that we don't always see. There's ways relating to ourselves that we don't always see. To come back to psychoanalysis, it's an unconscious process.
Mm.
And people will come working with me and they'll say, "Ah, I don't see any changes." I say, just hang in there, trust the process, all that stuff. And then a year in, they'll say, Ben, the weirdest thing happened to me. I say, oh, yeah, what happened? They say, how we always talk about how I'm so harsh and critical of myself and all that. I'm like, yeah, I remember that. They said, last week I was going to the store and I noticed these thoughts coming up. And I caught myself and I say, why am I talking so harshly to myself? And when I hear that, that's
Mm.
music to my ears. That's the work is working. We're cooking here. Um, I think we don't understand this is something that's hard to look at. It's hard to quantify, and that's okay. But we have to just keep giving ourselves the health that we need to do. It's kind of like if you go to the gym, if you're lifting weights or I don't know what one does, right? But if you're doing that for you know 3 months and or well, let's say you do it for 6 weeks and you come and you say, why am I not jacked? Well, any trainer will tell you, well, yeah, things are changing within. You just have to keep at it, and then eventually things will show if your goal's to be jacked or whatever your goal is, right? Um, I think we want to look at, we want concrete things to look at and say, oh, this is changing. But I think that does us a disservice. I think the beauty of therapy is teaching us another way of being. Yeah.
But would you not agree that you should be seeing, like,
Hmm.
we were talking about this before, I guess,
Sure.
but what is the metric then for
Oh,
whether or not the therapy, like, this is a
yeah.
therapeutic relationship? Because we
Yeah.
should be able to see some progress going on, or something should be happening
Of
here.
course.
It shouldn't feel like boring, right?
Oh, no, no,
Yeah.
no, no, definitely not. Yeah. So I mean, again, it's too hard to put into vague terms. I mean, I'm a believer that it should be goals, right? I mean,
Hmm.
in the work, you should always be saying, okay, like what are we working towards? Is it my relational patterns? Is it my self-talk? Is it my depression? Is it my anxiety? Right? I mean, there should always be things, right? But I will say, I mean, personally, I wouldn't even be concerned about changes for the first 4 months. I think you're just filling out the space, you're getting comfortable. You probably haven't even gotten to the real stuff. Sometimes that could
Hmm.
take months upon years to really get to certain things. I mean, I've been working with people for almost 4 years now, and they'll still share with me things that we've never talked about.
Hmm.
Now, again, I'm not saying therapy has to be that long, but sometimes it can take a while for certain things to come up. So that's just my one pushback. But I mean, you're 100% right. I mean, there should be goals. That's definitely right. And then also, I think if you're connecting to your therapist, if you like them after a few months, if you feel like this is the person who can help me, I think that's a great milestone. If you're talking about certain goals and you say, "Oh, actually, these goals are getting me somewhere," I mean, I think that's really great. Um, if you're noticing shifts within you, and it can be very minute. I mean, just the seeds of things. I think that's amazing. It's hard to speak in such broad terms, right? But like, I guess maybe be more specific, right? Like, let's say there was somebody who said, I always people please, I feel like I'm a burden and I don't like myself. Then the goals would be, noticing how often we do these things. I think noticing is very important. Two, I think it could also be, you know, uh, catching yourself and when you're being so critical and then saying, okay, you know, maybe I'm not at the point where I could believe that my harsh voices are incorrect. But you can just say this is not helpful. Internally, I think that's a great thing that somebody can do. Um, Three, noticing yourself maybe in social situations starting to take up more space and noticing that's okay, or being quiet and your friend saying, "Oh, what's going on with you? I feel like you're being quiet," and internalizing and coming to therapy and saying, "Ben, why am I always so quiet? Why am I not taking up more space?" I mean, these are all great milestones. But again, therapy is such a broad and complicated thing, and I think we reduce it. Um, there's this line that I really like by this like new age guru. He uses it for God. He says like a God defined is a God confined.
Hmm.
I kind of feel that with therapy sometimes. If we define it a little too much and we whatever, some of the magic gets lost because therapy has so many different aspects to them. Um, Is it okay if I ramble a little bit about the history of psychoanalysis?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. I guess to me, I think people don't know enough about the history of therapy. To go on a big tangent here, but one, therapy was started by Freud and Joseph Breuer, but actually, funny enough, really this guy named Joseph Breuer. They were colleagues. Um, Joseph Breuer sat with the first ever psychoanalytic patient. We don't. Well, I mean, we call her Annie O, but she probably had a different name. Um, and what was going on was Joseph Breuer was a doctor. He's used to, putting his hands on a patient, administering medicine, doing all these different things. And they were working together, and this woman, she was very distraught because I think she had like a traumatic experience. I don't remember exactly the details, but a lot of anxiety was coming from her traumatic experiences. And Joseph Breuer tried everything, and then at one point he was trying hypnosis, and he noticed that the more that the patient, Annie O, was talking about her problems, the better she was getting. And then he writes to Freud the most amazing line. He says, I couldn't believe that I could heal somebody but not putting my hands as a doctor on a patient. Just by talking, there could be a cathartic experience and releasing of one's inner turmoil. I think that is really the history of therapy. And then, interestingly enough, it gets coined by Annie O. She calls it the talking cure. So, two things with this. One, the history of therapy is 50% buy-in of the therapist and 50% buy-in of the patient. I think we overlook what, patients and people who are a part of therapy when they teach us about it. And then two, therapy was about, realizing that these two people talking could really heal something. There's something magical about that. And then, Joseph Breuer kind of gave up a bit on it. It's a very complicated story. And then Freud, who heard about it, was like basically in contact with him and decided, oh, I think we could do this, and maybe we can even get rid of the hypnotic part, the hypnosis part of it, and just talking, and maybe the actual just patient and therapist talking. Maybe that's a hypnotic state of sorts. Um, so Freud then was coming up with all these different ideas and trying to figure out all these different things. Um, but people, I think, incorrectly think that Freud had one treatment. But really, Freud had many different conflicting things that he says. So at one point, he has the famous idea that, did more harm than good, which is the Oedipus complex.
Yeah.
But, it's very unclear if he really bought into it in the end of his life. So, right, so there's this idea of like, these inner conflicts. And then at another point, the Dora case, he all of a sudden starts to come with this idea of the relational transference of maybe a client, seeing things within the patient that really they see in other people from their childhood or whatever. So we see this slow development and transference.
Yeah.
And then at another point, he has this amazing line on narcissism, where this is the most un-Freud thing you'll see. He says, "Love is the cure." So I guess what people misunderstand, and really within the beginning of the formations, because there was no therapy outside of Freud at this time, right? This is the early 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. He was slowly coming up with the talking cure. Obviously, this term was coined by Annie O, the first patient of psychoanalysis, right? But he was slowly trying to understand what the hell is the mind, what is the unconscious, what is going on with any of these things, and even he went back and forth in his life. And to me, that's what I take from Freud. This idea that therapy isn't something that can be that reduced, that can be that defined. And the beauty of therapy is that there's all these different things going on, and the human mind is so complicated. And the goal is just trying, almost like a detective of sorts. And funny enough, Freud actually read a lot of Sherlock Holmes. He was really into detective novels. Yeah, so as a therapist, you're here to really just be a detective and try to see all these different things that could coincide and that could relate to one another. So again, I think it's just a long-winded way of, a little ramble here, but to get into, to me, the beauty of therapy is not to confine it too much and not define it too much. And we have our directions and we have our things, but it's important to see that therapy is a very broad thing because the mind is very broad. So I don't know if that exactly got to what we were trying to get at, but I guess this is my belief on the complexity and the nuances and the breadth of the field of therapy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben Matz.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's wonderful talking to you as always.
Yeah, always a pleasure. It's nice to take it from the streets, Brooklyn to
absolutely
the studio.
Cool. Well, I think we could end it there.
Okay.
Thank you all for tuning in. I love you all. Is that a lie?
You tell me.
Sending love to you all. I hope you all are doing great. Maybe go outside today and touch some grass or say hello to a stranger. Be safe about it. But not too safe, right? You don't want to be too safe in life, right?
Yeah, I think we could all use a little bit more risk.
A little bit of risk in life. Yeah.
A little more rupture within our lives.
A little more rupture. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Take care.